Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Dr. Ramona Barrios-Sotillo. I'm the Associate Dean of Continuing and Community Education at our Garfield campus. And I'm happy to see some of our Garfield people here today, too. Thank you for being here. So, the person I'd like to introduce is someone that knows a thing or two about success. He's currently a PhD candidate at Claremont Graduate University of Higher Education and Leadership. He holds an MBA from Virginia Tech and his BA in Economics from the University of Virginia. Some of his accomplishments, both in the community, in private industry, and higher education includes, he currently works as the Assistant VP of Capital Projects and Facilities at Harvey Mudd College. He is CEO and Managing Partner at Pinteresco Advisors, LLC in La Cañada. He's an adjunct professor of statistics at Azusa Pacific University. He sat on the board of directors for the Los Angeles County Committee in School District Waco, some of us know them. CFO Treasurer for the board of directors at USC's Verdugo Hills Hospital Foundation. He was on the governing board for the La Cañada Unified School District between 2005 and 2013. He was also on the La Cañada Chamber of Commerce. He was a federally appointed member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission for Georgia Advisory Council. He's a National Merit Scholar. He's worked in private industry for several companies, including AT&T, Bell South Corporation, British Telecom, and Level 3 Communication, which is the largest fiber optic backbone network operator. So I had to ask what that was. He has served in the Navy as an officer, where he achieved the rank of lieutenant commander, and he served 4 years on a destroyer and an aircraft carrier. Our guest speaker holds many accomplishments and awards, and I could be here all day reading them all, but I want to get to his book. And oh, by the way, he wrote a book along with it. His book, Dreams of My Mother, A Story of a Love Transcended, was an Amazon bestseller novel and winner of the Huff Publishing Indie Fab Book of the year 2015, as well as other awards he received for the book. So it is with special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Joel Peterson to our campus.
Thank you, Ramona.
There we go. Got it.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you all for coming out. Wisdom sometimes comes from unique places and surprising places. And I had a piece of wisdom when I was teaching at Virginia Tech, come from my cleaning lady. She had been born and raised in the county and had never left, ever. And she and I were talking one late evening when I was grading papers, and she talked about her children, how they traveled and so forth, and I asked her, I said, well, aren't you interested in going somewhere and looking at all these places? The world's a big place. And she said to me something that I thought was both profound and sad. She said, nope, don't see no reason why. Every place is just like here, just different. Every place is just like here, just different. The sad part, because I thought that was very profound, the sad part was she really didn't understand how much alike maybe people were, and also how fundamentally different here can be in life situations and circumstances. And really, my talk today is about the book that kind of touches on these kind of components, about not only how we are so much the same, but how we can be so different, and what are some of the elements that drive this. So I'm going to cover 3 areas. One is kind of put a context for the historical element. Where did all this kind of thing of adoption, international adoption, how did this kind of happen? What has that meant? A little bit about my personal story in that. And then a lot of people have been asking me about the writing process. How do you get published? How did you get out with a book? You know, how did you create the book in the way you did? So I thought I'd cover these 3 things and then try to spend as much time as possible just having a dialogue. So one of the key things is, what we sometimes call the forgotten war, the Korean War. The Korean War was pivotal for many, many reasons. One of the things is that the US Constitution gives the right to declare war to Congress. World War II, FDR went before Congress, requested a declaration of war, they gave it. The Korean War, there was no declaration of war. There was something that was called the United Nations, and America was one of the first progenitors and key components of it, and it was a United Nations resolution that said you cannot go ahead and do aggression against other member states, and this is what started this out. The reality was that the vast majority of the troops were from America, but after 3 years, 36,000 plus American service members were killed. It was a very brutal war. And at the time, there was a whole thing of saying, why do you want your son to die for a tie? Because we weren't about the business of winning. We were about the business of doing a political action, about the business of containing. So it was a very different world, a very different time. In all that context, there was a tiny little place that was called Korea that was devastated. Millions of Chinese and Koreans were killed in this conflict. And like so many things, what you ended up then with occupying foreign force, a lot of scared 18, 19-year-old men, you ended up having outcomes of unions with the local population. I happen to be one of those. First official international adoption from Korea was in 1953. Korean adoption ended up creating the template for what became adoption, both domestically and internationally, and it morphed into what became the 1998 Hague Convention on Human Trafficking. And this had some good points and some bad points. One of the reasons, as Ramona kindly pointed out, is that in my PhD studies, education is a social science, and most of social sciences, we struggle with one key difficulty. How do you untie the social influence from the physical and genetic influence? So if we go and we find a study that says, read to your kids, have lots of books, talk to them in the car, question them at dinner, and we find that there's a correlation to education outcomes. But maybe it's just because the people who have above average cognitive ability own a lot of books. They read a lot of books. They read books to their kids. They talk a lot in the car, at the dinner table. So maybe what we're really seeing here is a genetic condition, not an environmental one. And this is something that is very hard in social science. How do you delink these things? One way to do it would be take all these kids out of these homes, scramble them up, and reassign them to homes that they're not genetically related to. Most IRBs would not approve this. But this was done to about somewhere between 150 and 200,000 human beings who were taken out of their biologically rated homes, randomly assigned to non-genetically related people, and you grew up. And there are people who are researchers who are using this sample to try to ask some social questions. There's a individual named Bruce Sasserdort at Dartmouth who has done a lot of research. He's an economist, and he's looked at the link between family income and education outcomes, and he's used Korean adoptees as a control population because what he's found is that this is a unique element. Probably the country that has done most study of Korean adoptees is Sweden. Sweden adopted more Korean adoptees on a per capita basis than any other country. The United States adopted the most in large numbers. So if about 200,000 Korean adoptees, Korean children were adopted, about 150,000 in the United States, the rest into other places, but Sweden was one of the largest. The interesting thing about Sweden and many European countries is that they start tracking children pretty young. So at 16, every Swedish child goes through a set of tests, not only for subjects, but for things like what we call the SAT, to decide are they going to go on to research universities? Are they going to go on to vocational, technical things? Are they going to go into apprentice programs, this sort of thing? Which may be something that we in America are uncomfortable with. And so they have this rich data where they can look across all Swedish children. And what they found was something kind of interesting. They found that Korean adoptees, number one, did better than all other international adoptees. And the question then is, wow, those Korean kids are smart, huh? No, not necessarily. It's just that Korea was one of the only industrialized modern societies that continued to adopt children to other countries. So its institutions, its orphanages had doctors and nurses. They had food, they had enrichment, etc. Unlike places like, say, a Romania or a Nigeria or other places. So this isn't unusual that you would expect then Korean children to maybe done better, because they had a different environment. The other part is that most adopted populations are skewed. They do not represent the population as a whole. Most children who are put up for adoption oftentimes come from the poorest of society, the least educated, most troubled, sometimes have congenital issues. In fact, some countries demand that only those children who have some kind of issue are available for adoption. But in Korea, the social stigma of single motherhood was so severe that 90% of all women who give birth as a single mother give their child up to an institution. Compare that to less than 1% in the United States. So what this meant was that the population of adoptees were very similar to the population as a whole. So again, you would then expect that outcomes would be significantly different versus other countries. But then there was a surprising thing. What they found was that Korean adoptees performed better and had better life outcomes than native-born, non-adoptive Swedes. Go figure, how did this happen? Why is this? Well, one of the things that people don't understand is Sweden has about a 90% divorce rate. Not unlike many modern industrialized societies. It's not a moral judgment. But what it does mean is that those who adopt, part of the things that they have to qualify for, one of those things is that they have to be in stable two-parent unions. And so these are children who are being adopted and raised in two-parent environments that were more stable, that were higher educated, that were more wealthy, and consequently you started seeing the outcomes that you had. So this has lots of ramifications for sociological research, many, many kind of things. So it's a fascinating kind of component. One of the things I put out here is that Korean adoptees also represent a unique sociological, maybe psychological potential population to study, because it's the only large population of people that their identities have been formed, disaggregated. Almost all of you sitting in this room, your identity, I am me, I feel who I am, based on your ethnicity, your race, your nationality, your culture. And they're all tied completely together, except Korean adoptees. Preponderantly, they were adopted by non-Asians. They were adopted in many different countries, so many different nationalities, multiple different cultures. I have a friend of mine, his name is Johnny Lee Horowitz, very Korean looking, adopted as an infant to a Jewish family, raised Jewish, very Korean looking. So the other part is that this is the only large immigrant population where there is no linkage, no sense of group identity. So if you're Italian, come here, you're like, oh, you're Italian, we're this kind of thing. Korean adoptees don't suddenly go ahead and say, oh, well, you're a Korean adoptee, therefore there's no shared element, there is no commonality. So it's a very, very unique population in many, many ways. Sociologically, extremely interesting. And I did a lot of my research because I was going to use this population as a way to normalize and try to rationalize some of the social research that I wanted to do in education. So with that, this is a little bit of how many Korean children were being adopted into the United States. Through 2004 and beyond is very, very relatively static until very recently. But one of the things you can see is that the peak was in 1986. Korea was definitely a industrialized first world country. It was a G8 country at that time. So it tells you it's a very different thing. But part of what drove Korean adoption and part of what created this international adoption, when you look at the early parts, is that there was a perfect storm of a number of things. One was in the 1960s, the pill. Women who didn't want to have children didn't have to have children. What that meant was there was a massive decline in the population of white children who are unwanted. Late 60s, early 70s, civil rights movement, African American identity. There was a whole kind of movement that said white people should not be raising non-white people because it's a way to eradicate non-white people. So there was a movement that made it difficult to adopt non-white people. And then lastly, there was this whole kind of thing of a movement that's, and I think the pendulum has maybe swung somewhat the other way, but it was that, we human beings, we wanted to think that we are not prisoners of our genetics, that any child can become anything, that all that needs is love. And if you just love that child and you bring that child into a home, then they can be that member of that home and that member of that society no matter what. I think we've since realized that environment and genetics, biology and outcome have an interplay between themselves. But at the time, it was very fashionable and considered intellectually open to go and say, I don't see color, I only see a person, and all they need is love. And so because of that, you had this huge rise in the 70s of this kind of thing. The other part, too, is that if you wanted to adopt domestically, there were all sorts of restrictions. You couldn't be older than 40 years old. You had to have a minimum income. You had to be married. You had to have a job. International adoption, no such thing. You could go ahead and be 60 and you could adopt. You didn't have to be married. You didn't have to have a job. You didn't have to have a minimum income. So there were many reasons as that perfect storm of why there was all this adoption, and particularly then out of Korea. The original one was that in Korea, from the Korean War, there was a couple last name was Holt, who adopted 7 mixed race Korean children. And they kind of, before YouTube, before all this stuff, hit it out of the ballpark with a documentary that made national headlines and was toured in movie theaters. And the whole theme was, there are American children that we have left behind. That's what mixed race was called. And so there was this huge demand then to go ahead and adopt these American children. But of all the 200,000 Korean adoptees that have ever been adopted, less than 2% are mixed race. So pretty soon the supply of people like me ran out, and suddenly the rest of Korea said, hey, we have all these other children in orphanages, let's go ahead and make them available as well. And then Korean adoptions, you can see this is sort of as a percentage of all international adoptions. You can see it's about 40%. So you can see that of all countries, Uganda, Nigeria, India, Romania, Kazakhstan, Nicaragua, Korea is preponderantly where it came from. And only very recently has it skewed in other directions. So the next part is telling you a little bit about my personal story on why, what the book is about. So all of us have fascinating and interesting and consuming lives to ourselves. Not one of us goes and says, you know what, I am so bored with my life. Every part of our life consumes us. very few of us have lives that consume other people. So what I wanted to do then was to tell a story that is really not so much about my life, but really was a life about two women. One as a tribute to my mothers, but also because I think we believe, we have created this thing called the institution of mom, which is so colossal. There's even a religion for it. I mean, Catholicism, Mother Mary. No actual human being can ever live up to the institution of mom. And no actual human being can ever live up to the relationship, the obligations, or anything we should. So all of us have some kind of angst with our mom. And most moms have some kind of angst with being a mom. And I wanted to tell a story of two women who were genuine, normal, human, trapped in the circumstances of their life and of their time, yet how they dealt with being mom. And most children, we've all been children, and we all know, we were not the active subjects of our life. We were the passive objects. Things happened to us. Our mothers made decisions, our fathers made decisions, our teachers made decisions, and then it just impacted us. But my two mothers were the active subjects of this story. They made decisions, and the most fascinating thing is not just about what decisions people make, but is when you make a decision, what are the outcomes, intended and non-intended, and how did you deal with those outcomes? That's the fascinating part, and that's what I thought would be interesting, and that's what I wanted to write about, and that's why it's called Dreams of My Mothers. I also learned, because Barack Obama got a lot of flack for almost never mentioning anything about his grandmother, his mother in his book. Wonderful book, I'm not disparaging, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to repeat that mistake, so I doubled down. Dreams of My Mothers, make sure. So I grew up in a place that, at another time and place, we would call Third World. We now call it the undeveloped country. No electricity, no medicine. It was a society where 1 out of 5 children did not reach the age of 5. And so these are actual photographs of the village I grew up in 1968 when I was growing up there. Fascinating thing about social media is that you have an American GI that was stationed there who took these photos, posted them to the web, made them public domain. And there you go. And you get a sense of, there was no running water, no sanitation. The picture on the left actually could be the domicile that I might have grown up in terms of the look and everything very similar. But even after the Korean War, there was still a lot of American military occupation. We had 30 to 50,000 troops over the course of the last 60, 70 years. And what that tended to mean is that when you have lonely young men, scared and far away, sometimes, and you have a population that is destitute, the oldest industry thrives, and sometimes the outcome of some of those unions happen as well. And so you end up with a lot of children unattended, running around in the street in a dusty third world country without sanitation, without electricity. And one of them was me. So you can see that the picture on the left, that was taken in 1969, and literally months later, the transformation of my life. Going from not only a distance of 10,000 miles and a different culture and a different language, but this was, kind of the Daniel Boone, Laura Ingalls Wilder days. This was animal power, and it was, black and white, and this kind of thing. And to suddenly, within a matter of months, land in Brady Bunch land. What a wonderful kind of thing, but the disconnect and the transformation was incredibly profound. And for any child to go through that. And it wasn't just the family that was that way, but the whole place. I grew up in a place that was called the Valley of the Jolly Green Giant. It was the Minnesota River Valley in Minnesota. It was where the Green Giant Company had over 6 of its packing plants. And yes, all the people looked pretty much like that. They were all Scandinavians. They were mostly Swedish, a smattering of Norwegians, who my grandfather told me was the enemy. And, and you can see in the bottom photo there, that little dot is a car. The rest is snow, That's the kind of thing. And I actually got a text yesterday from my sister saying they'd had their first snow. Oh, yeah, sure, So this is the world, and people like me that looked like me and had any kind of background different than this was extremely rare. I was the only person in my town that had 3 traffic lights that looked anything like me. And then in my last year of high school, I was fortunate enough to get a Rotary International Exchange Scholarship to go to Japan, and that's a picture of me and my mother when she's seen me off at the airport. And the bottom one is a picture of me and my Korean mother when I found her again. That when I was in Japan, I was able to go ahead and go over to Korea, and through some very fortunate circumstances, was able to connect. So if you want to learn more, got to read the book. And then I was fortunate enough, I went to the University of Virginia, which is also very different than the place I was born and the place that I grew up. And then I was very fortunate that our country felt fit to give me a commission as a U.S. Navy officer. I served 7 years on active duty, and was able to feel like I made a contribution. My parents instilled in me a basic point. They said, if you are willing to take the benefits of society, then you should step up to the obligations of society. And so that was the reason behind my service. And then I was very fortunate that from the Navy, and I had gotten an MBA, I was able to go into corporate America. And this is a photo from actually the newspaper from Doha, Qatar, called the Daily Peninsula. And I had created a joint venture between AT&T and Qatar Telecom, and we created the largest data hosting center in the Persian Gulf region. And I was very fortunate to be able to do these kinds of things. And I've been able to do many things because of the circumstances of my adoption and of the society I live in. I was able to meet the love of my life. I have a son, and what I firmly believe is that my story could only happen in America. And I don't mean to make light of that. I have had the fortune to be able to live in many, many countries. I've traveled to probably 80 plus countries. I've lived in probably a dozen countries and worked. And there are many things wrong with America. There are many things we need to improve. There are many things that we fall short. But what I know from personal experience of having lived, struggled, and interacted in many other places where when we talk about racism, it is so much more embedded. When we talk about classism, it is so much more so. That I am a firm believer that America is not perfect. We cause some of the problems. Sometimes we are the problem. But I truly believe that no solution will happen without America, and all of us need to work to help to do that. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off of that and move to the next part. Because a lot of people asked about writing. They're like, okay, so you wrote this stuff. What about this getting published thing? So today, 1.3 million new books are published every year. Over 4,000 new books are published every day. 80-90% of them never sell more than about 50 to 100 copies. Most of this explosion has been because of self-publishing. Even though it looks like there's all sorts of different publishing companies out there, the vast majority, there's only about a dozen companies that control about 70% of the entire publishing market. 5 companies control 50% of all publishing. 70% of all books are distributed through only one company, Amazon. So it's a very, very different world, and what it takes to try to become published is very different and very difficult. I was very fortunate that I had a publisher reach out to me, which is highly unusual, and most likely, for most people who want to get published in the mainstream, it's very, very difficult to do that. I was fortunate that it did make the Amazon Best Publishing. It made a top 5, a top 10, and a top 100 category in a number of different things. I think the thing I'm most proud of is the number 1 or the number 10 in all books, electronic and physical, dealing with adoption. So probably maybe 3 books out there, but what the heck, I'll take the credit. And I was fortunate that I got a lot of press for it, and said, a lot of people said a lot of nice things. But what I'm most proud of is that even though it's only been published in English, this is the kind of metrics that you can get. And you can see that, first of all, readers are women. Men, not so much. And the older you are, more likely you are to read as a woman. But it also shows that, and I don't, it's not the total list of countries, it's been over 40 countries, but you can see that I had to look up Anguilla. It's a British overseas territory in the Caribbean. Last year it won twice in a row. This year and last year is the best Caribbean destination for, so 14,000 people, and they bought my book. So, but a lot of different countries, this kind of thing. And then, this shows you that in the bottom left is Kinokuniya is the largest book seller and bookstore in many places in Asia and in Malaysia in particular, and they're selling my book. And on the right is a review that was written in Japanese by a Japanese reader that had bought my book through the Japanese version of Amazon. And I'm very grateful for the critics whose job it is to try to go ahead and help us understand what's worthwhile reading, to think that they thought it was okay. So I thought I would conclude the last part on sort of the writing process. And the reason I have this picture on the right has to do with, I wrote an article for Huffington Post that was called 4 Questions You Should Ask Yourself Before Writing Your Life Story. And they reprinted it. This is the largest publisher in Finland, and they translated it into Finnish and reprinted it. So if you can read Finnish, you can read that. I can't, other than my name, which they kept. But the key kind of things, especially when you're writing any kind of book, but anything that's biographical, was sort of what is the structure, what are the considerations, what are the themes and devices. And so I used a non-linear temporal time frame. All of us have lives. Most of our life is really boring. It's called commuting and traffic and things like that, and changing diapers. So you don't write about that stuff. And then it's really hard, and most stories you want to have is a beginning, a middle, and an end, and some sort of culmination, but most of our lives don't work that way. So if we just start at the beginning and just kind of tell it, we may have ups and downs and stuff, and it's hard to create that sort of sense of anticipation and culmination. So I chose moving back and forth between time and place. And then the question is, are you going to write it first person, third person? Are you going to write from one perspective, multiple perspectives? I chose multiple perspectives. I used sort of the template of several movies that use multiple characters and different perspectives to see, to try to tell a story that you don't know what the truth is other than through the eyes of all the characters. And that's what I try to do here. Other kind of considerations are things like, people are like, well, you said it's biographical fiction, so how much of it is false, how much of it is true? So, well, everything happened, but obviously I couldn't be there for everything. I didn't know everything in everyone's head. I didn't know everything in anyone's heart. And so those were the parts that were dramatized. And the publisher, being a small publisher, said, by the way, we don't want to take legal risks, so if you call it fiction, you can't get sued for a libel. So, that's one of the kind of things. Themes, I talked a little bit about that the issue was not so much talking about myself, but I tried to put it into three categories, or three phases. The first phase was to introduce the reader to a character, a little boy, and to identify and connect. The next phase was to introduce the two women and the choices and issues that they were facing. And the last phase was about the consequences and what they might have to deal with. That's sort of how I planned out the book. And talking about devices, so when you do, the danger in jumping back and forth in time and place is you don't get this sense of movement. How do people know that there's an ending that's going to happen? You know, well, it was yesterday and all of a sudden it's 5 years ago and now it's tomorrow, I don't know. And so I used the vehicle or the device of actually two literally vehicles, one a jet plane, another a boat, and they represented both the socioeconomic and time difference between things, but then the reader knew that both of them were going to a destination. That no matter all the jumping back and forth, the ship was going to dock and something was going to happen, the plane was going to land and something was going to happen. So it kept you wanting to go, at least I hoped, to say, I want to know what happens when that plane lands, what happens when that ship docks, and then does it all tie together? How do the ship and plane actually link together? So those were the kind of mechanisms that I used. I was told by one speaking event I did that I should give notice that there is strong language and graphic scenes and so forth. I was also told by somebody that they should be on the front cover because a little bit like Ramona, they were on a vacation, they got on a plane, they opened the book and started reading it, and they started breaking out crying, and the person next to them thought there was something horrible going on, and they said, you need to put a warning on your book. And see if I can...
This book has more meat.
It's a very powerful story.
Amazing, courageous story. The story's magnificent.
It's more than a story about adoption.
One of the best books out there. It was actually unlike anything I've ever read.
There are many surprises along. You need to read this book.
That was really a powerful, surprising story.
I found myself deeply connected with a central character.
The appeal is wide in this book.
I really draw a very strong connection on a very clear emotional
And I
level.
think it was an actually beautiful way to write a book.
Life lesson.
The great ending.
There were several times in the book where I actually cried. Almost as poetic.
So with that, happy to take any questions.
What age were you when you adopted, and how did you determine, did you get to take part in choosing your name that you would go by in America? And I want to know everything, and I'm going to read the book, but I want to know, how did you feel when you saw your mother? Okay, I'll stop there.
So I think the question basically was, one, how old was I? And then did I have any role in my name and so forth? So I was essentially 7. So it was very different, and this is the courage that I would say that my birth mother had. For her to choose to have me and keep me. So think about a society that was highly focused on racial purity. And so she was the lowest of society. You know, obviously she's a uneducated, undeveloped country prostitute. And for her to keep me knowing that I was racially mixed, you know, I was her walking Scarlet A. So if you think of an uneducated, single, 20-something mother in Selma, Alabama in 1926, walking around holding the hand of her half-black child, that was the world that she lived in. And she tried. She did her best for 7 years. But ultimately, one of the things that I realized was that in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen if you are born in U.S. territory. many other countries, places like France and other places, and Korea at the time, and Korea now, was that they go by something that is called it doesn't matter whether you're born in the territory, it's whether you have a parent or parents who are. And in Korea, until June 13th of 1998, if your father was not a Korean citizen, you were not a Korean citizen, regardless of whether your mother was, regardless of whether you were born in Korea or not. And so when I became 6 and 7 years old, I had no right to a public education. I couldn't be educated. There was no path to become a lawful worker. There was only going to be one path, and that was going to be on the very margins. And when she realized that this was a situation, she had zero resources, then she sought other options. So, that's the good and the bad. Is I feel very fortunate that unlike the vast majority of the 200,000 Korean adoptees and many other adoptees who adopt as infants and wonder about their mothers and what their life might have been, I don't have to wonder about what my life would have been. I know.
So I noticed that your second mother had a family with other children, your siblings. How did they decide to adopt?
Great question. So the question is, how or why did my adoptive family decide to adopt when they already had 4 children of their own? Both, they had a son and they had 3 daughters. So it's not like, well, we want one gender and I don't want to risk getting one more the same. My mother was, for all her ordinariness, in my mind, was a very exceptional person. And one of the things that she would have said is, if you're driving down the highway and you see an accident, and you see people on the side of the road that need help, the first thing you don't ask yourself is, how many people do I have in my car and do I have room? You pull over, you stop, you help. And that's how she saw it. She didn't go and say, I already got 4 kids. I already got both genders. She saw it as, there is a need. I have been blessed. We have been blessed. We have capacity. I'm going to pull over and do what's the right thing.
How did you become aware of that need?
So, as I told you, that there had been this whole thing with the Holtz doing this kind of stuff. And the Holtz were, he was a minister, kind of a fringe evangelical-ish kind of one. And my parents were very devout Lutherans. And in the Lutheran magazine, which was a monthly publication, there was an article that came out about how there was this need for, that there were these children who, partly due to the actions of the United States, that they were, in institutions and in need of families. And, she believed in her heart of hearts that her God talked to her and told her this is what she should do.
Probably this isn't the book, as I'm going to buy and read it, but I'm just feeling very emotional at this point as a mother of 3. So 7 is an age where you're aware of things happening to you, and as you mentioned in your talk, that decisions were made, parents make decisions for their children. And so, I don't know the details obviously, but when it was decided for your Korean mother to give you up for adoption, were you in an orphanage or were you living with her? Or how did you feel when she or somebody approached you about just leaving your mom and moving into a totally different country?
That's a great question. So the question was, how did this decision happen? Was I in an orphanage at the time? How did it come about? What did I feel about going to a different country, etc.? So one of the things was that it was very much drilled into me in Korea as a mixed-race child that I was not Korean. Literally beaten into me. So I grew up not necessarily thinking of myself as Korean per se. And my mother, I lived with her until I was just about 7. And then when she initially put me she filed to put to qualify to try to get me into the adoption system back when I was 5, and then had to go through a number of evaluation kind of things, and then eventually she signed the final papers and so forth in sort of late fall of 1969 when I was 6. And then they put me into a orphanage. It was the first only Korean-owned and run institution called Korean Social Services. And they put you there as a way to start to get you acclimated to being away from your mother. And so I lived there for a number of months. And then in January of 1970, they have a group of children that would be going over to the U.S., and they would have a couple of chaperones that flew us over. And so literally, I got on a plane one day and landed the next day, and this is your new family. And it was December night. It was cold as all get out in Minnesota. We drove from Minneapolis for like 2 hours. I couldn't understand anybody, and I was amazed by the smells of everything from body odor to cologne to, Asians don't have as much body hair, so I was amazed at the amount of body hair people had, the size of people's noses. I was just like, oh my God, this is, as a kid you notice all sorts of weird things. But, it was, but it was a decision that my, mother made, and she made what she thought was the best thing possible. And one of the things that's potentially fascinating, and I did write an article that was published, one of the things that people wonder about is so many Korean adoptees wonder, they have all these stories of being abandoned, that they were left on the steps of a police station, left on the steps of a bus station, left on the steps of a mall kind of thing. And they're like, why was I so unwanted that I was abandoned like this? Why wasn't I even at least brought into an orphanage? And again, it goes back to that law, because Korean law said if your father was not Korean, which meant a Korean man had to claim you as his child, whether under matrimony or not, you weren't a citizen. However, there was a loophole that if a child where you couldn't know if they were orphaned, you couldn't identify their parents, and they were found abandoned inside Korean territory, they were afforded Korean citizenship. So if you are a single mother in Korea and you know that your child can't have the benefits of Korean citizenship, education, public services, healthcare, legal work, maybe the one thing that they could do to give their child the best outcome was to go ahead and do this abandonment. The truly abandoned, we never found them. They were left in ditches somewhere. But, if you go ahead and you abandon a child at a police station, and there are laws against abandoning children, so it's a risk. So these were women who took a risk to do something unlawful to give their child the best possible outcome. And this probably explains why that there were so many Korean adoptees who were, quote unquote, abandoned. Yes, sir.
On the other end of that question, I guess, what were the feelings? I'm sure it was when you saw your mother again years later. If you could say like one thing was overwhelming, feeling or emotion, what would it be?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Great question. It was, what was the number one emotional feeling when you did find your mother again? And I wrote a HuffPost article about it, so you can read it. But the key thing, I guess, was being shocked that I was seeing this person. So everything that I had felt as that small boy still was inside me. Everything that you feel when you're 5 or 6 years old about your mother. This was, parents at that, when you're that age, they are elements of nature. You know, they are larger than life. They are life. And I still had that. But then I was just struck by like, oh, wow, she's like, comes up to here. I'm not a tall guy, so, you know. And suddenly here's this, and then I'm realizing suddenly I know nothing about this person. I didn't know her favorite color. I didn't know her food. I didn't know who her friends were. You know, I didn't even know her birthday. So there was this complete duality through which I was seeing. At the same time, though, it coalesced in me what my identity was, that I was, you know, yes, this is my mother, yes, but I knew that, you know, the little boy that had taken off in an airplane out of Seoul, in one sense, never landed. You know, there was a different boy that came about from landing that became me. And my world, my American society, my American worldview was nothing that had anything to do with someone like her and her world and her view. And what it made me realize was that being American is not about, you know, a piece of dirt that we are all from. It is not about a shared mythology or religion that we all come from. It is not a, you know, a religion that we all embrace together. But ultimately is that we embrace two facts. One is that we are all equal, and secondly, that we are all different. And we will defend the right to be different. Republicans hate Democrats, especially with this last round, and vice versa. But people will defend the right to be Democrat, and Democrats will defend the right to be Republican. Other countries don't do that. Other societies don't do that. And that's when I realized, you know what, my true identity is tied up with this society, you know, and not about some other kind of things.
It's kind of a tough question. Do you resent Korea because of the policy for you not to be a citizen of the country? Do you harbor a real will for that, or is it? Do you really think about that, or should it change and you have feelings on that?
The question is, you know, do I resent Korea for its policies and so forth? The answer is absolutely no. I mean, France has the exact same policy. I don't resent the French, and I don't think a lot of other people do. Germany has the same thing. Many societies have, you define citizenship in many different ways. And there are people who may resent, and goodness knows, you know, poor President Obama was subject to people questioning because of the physical location of where he was, or even John McCain, the fact that he was born in Panama, even though it was a U.S. territory at the time. So policies are what they are. And Korea was what it was at its time. And what I am concerned about, though, is that there's been a huge movement to this whole. It is good that we have the Hague Convention on Human Trafficking, but what this also has done is it has said it is better to ensure that no child is ever unwillingly relinquished than that we go ahead and allow relinquished children to be able to be brought into a home somewhere. And what we know is that being raised in institutions and raised in foster homes is significantly less positive outcomes than being raised in an adoptive home. There is no other social intervention that is more successful than adoption. It's more successful than weight loss interventions, than anti-smoking interventions, than drug abatement interventions, than education interventions. You know, the success rates, life success, education success of adoptees today are actually higher than biological children because the vast majority of adoptees are raised in two-parent stable homes. And we know right now is that 40% of all children today are born to single mothers. And it is not to vilify single mothers in any way, shape, or form. It's just simply saying that the research seems to point to that, you know, two-parent stable environments are significantly beneficial. And therefore, you know, denying that opportunity because maybe it's painful. A lot of people say adoption is painful. People go through all this stuff. But think of it as like, being relinquished is like having childhood cancer. We know that if you have childhood leukemia, there's only about 3 things you can do. You can do a bone marrow transfusion, you can do chemotherapy, you can do radiation. And what we know is of the 3, bone marrow is the most successful. Why would we outlaw that as an option? Even because people say it's painful, because it's not 100% successful, because there are people who live with lifelong scars because of it. Adoption is painful. Being adopted is painful. You have lifelong scars. You never get past certain things. But I know what my life would have been. I don't have some fantasy about what it could have been. And so denying that and making that unlawful, even as a potential option, as much as we should support families, parents, single, male or female, either way, we should do everything we can, but to take it off the table, that's the part that I'm concerned about, more so than the fact that you had a country that had a set of laws that are no different than many other countries.
Joel, a couple of times you've mentioned good and bad outcomes for various things. And I'm wondering what metrics are you using to describe that outcome? Are we talking about an economic outcome, a psychological outcome? What sort of metrics are we talking about?
That's a great question when we talk about good and bad. So typically it's saying people who have, are employed, who have self-actualized lives, that they are not dependent on the public, that they're contributing to society, that they are not in the criminal justice system, that they are not dependent on any kind of psychological support, in terms of medication or debility. The respective outcomes is about the same. I mean, we study all this time about when children are raised in at-risk environments, and this is what happens. The reality is all of us are descended from a gazillion generations of children who grew up in horrendous circumstances and who then turn out to be still kind of okay, able to hunt and work for the tribe and do the kind of stuff, because all the ones who couldn't are extinct. We're the ones who are descended from the ones who survived. And the reality is that biologically born and raised children by their parents have the same sort of, about 90-ish% don't get into the criminal justice system, do reasonably well educationally, are gainfully employed, will have children, follow laws, pay taxes, and adoptees are the same. There is almost no difference. It's not the same as saying, are they happy? I mean, we all live lives of quiet desperation, but it isn't to say that part. But it is to say that these other objective metrics or gross metrics, that's what we're using for success. I think time has run out, so if there's no more questions, I want to thank Glendale College for having me here. Thank you all for giving your time and attention, and thank you, Ramona, for thinking that it was worthwhile to have me come here. I so appreciate it.